I'm going to welcome those of you who are joining our session this afternoon. This is the first in a series of 8 presentations on the broad theme of crossing borders, leaving home, making new lives, and sustaining communities. I am John Tutino. I am the director of the Georgetown Americas Forum. I will quickly simply say I am a historian of Mexico, Mexican communities in the context of the larger world. And I want to begin by thanking the Georgetown Americas Forum and our co-sponsor, the Americas Initiative, for putting this series together, sponsoring it, and making it available. I also want to early on to start this series, and I'm going to do it, I'm sure, again at the end. I want to thank Marcella Harden, who does the program work for the Americas Forum, and Carolina Marin, who organizes the programs for the Americas Institute. None of this would have happened today without all of their efforts. I also want to, in a preliminary way, share with you all that this is being recorded and a captioned video will be posted on the Americas Institute website. And the operative word is soon, but it should be available reasonably soon for any who want to see it again or let others know. And then I want to emphasize that after the presentation of today's speaker, we'll open with a bit of conversation between ourselves, and then we're going to, much more importantly, open to questions from our audience. And at that point, we would ask that you open your Q&A at the bottom of your screen and type in your questions so that we can move forward and share them appropriately. Last thing I want to emphasize, again, this is the first in a series of 8. The full schedule is on the Americas Institute website. 4 sessions in February, all on leaving home. 4 more from late March to late April on making new lives in communities in the United States. Hopefully you'll join us for as many as you find engaging and interesting. Today, to begin, we welcome Larissa Veloz. Her topic is women crossing borders, family migration from 1890 to 1965. Larissa teaches history at the University of Texas, El Paso, so she lives the border and its crossings every day. And I will add that she comes from a family life in which women leading border crossings is a defining part of her heritage. So she comes to this topic with exceptional, both personal and scholarly grounding. She studied at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where she got an MA in Latin American Studies, and then came to Georgetown, where she earned a PhD in history. At Georgetown, she completed a dissertation with the main title of Even the Women Are Leaving, a study that covered the period from about 1900 to 1950. And that work won the Glassman Award as the best dissertation in the humanities at Georgetown, the year of its completion. She has now extended the work to go deep into the 1960s. And I will say, with a lack of specificity, that we soon expect to make an announcement that a leading university press is going to publish this as an important book. But more important, it's time to let Larissa speak for herself and for the many women who have made migrant flows and migrant communities. So welcome, Larissa.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And I want to thank John Tutino for inviting me to this series of talks. I'd also like to thank the Georgetown College Americas Forum and the Georgetown Americas Institute for sponsoring the event. And of course, I had hoped for this to be in person. And so, but you know, the silver lining of that is that we have opened this up to many more people. And in fact, I think there is a decent contingent zooming in from the borderland. So I'll just thank some of my colleagues and my students at the University of Texas at El Paso for zooming in today for this. And thank all of you for joining us this evening, afternoon, wherever you are, to listen in to this first of a series of really great talks. Again, I want to emphasize that I'm cognizant of the fact that I am in a lineup of a lot of other great speakers to whom I owe a debt of gratitude to many of them for inspiring me in my own work. And so again, this is just the first of many talks. So I hope that you join us for that. I'm also cognizant of the fact that a lot of the speakers will be basically emphasizing the later part of the 20th century. So what I aim to do today is to talk to you about the early 20th century, specifically focusing on women and family in their migrations across the US-Mexico border. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and start the PowerPoint. So you'll be hearing me and mostly looking at images of women who have crossed. I will showcase their stories primarily, but we're also talking about extended families, right? We're talking about the way in which looking at migration through the lens of women's experiences and family experiences also is going to tell us a good deal more about men's experiences in terms of Mexican migration. We often think of this as very labor driven. And I want to kind of emphasize and assert that so many migrations from, well, everywhere across the globe, I suppose, to different places are driven by family-centered reasons and not just labor, although that's been the story we've often been told, specifically with regards to Mexican migration. So I'm going to go ahead and try this and share the screen here. So what I want to do is provide snapshots into some of these experiences of women who crossed borders really as early as the 1890s. And I'll try to get probably mostly up to the 1950s, but I will dabble a little bit with 1960s and 1970s. And I'll just kind of showcase a couple of snapshots right here. But what I want to do before I get into kind of the narrative of this talk is to basically make a couple comments about the importance of, again, looking at women's experiences and what it tells us more broadly about Mexican migration. I'll start by saying that, frankly, the history of female migration is difficult to uncover. And actually, any of you who study immigration know that finding evidence of an often very mobile population that does not often leave written records is difficult to trace out. And there are added complications to finding the stories of women. And that's a topic I can address in the latter part of this talk and in the Q&A. But it's vital to keep on searching for these stories and these histories, especially in the archives. And I can talk more about this also. We know that one of the ways to get at these stories is through oral histories, but that inevitably leads us not being able to know much about the early history. And so there are traces in the archives. So I want to encourage anybody who's still looking for that to keep following that thread. In my search for the stories of women who cross borders, it became evident very quickly that although dominant portrayals of this era of Mexican migration describe mostly men crossing the border, mostly for agricultural labor, women and children also crossed, and so did the elderly. The elderly are also some folks that we don't often think about when we're just thinking through a labor lens. And so these women and children were often less visible, but equally crucial to creating communities in the United States. And these communities kept on growing throughout the 20th century. So Mexican immigration history is often told through these parallel histories of US policy, economic contractions, and the demand for overwhelmingly male Mexican laborers to the Southwest. And these histories so often dominate what we know about Mexican immigrants that even our contemporary understanding and political debates are often still framed within these channels. But there is another story that is often faded to the background, and that's one that centers on family. In recent years, as family separation along the border has garnered more attention, border policies and their power to demarcate the legality and illegality of immigrant bodies have become increasingly questioned. But more than just a gateway or sort of a revolving door for necessary or excess laborers, the US-Mexico border should be recognized as a gateway for family migrations. And these migrations created binational families. And when I say binational families, I don't just mean kind of bicultural families or families that moved back and forth together as a unit, but actual binational families with multiple statuses, folks born on both sides of the border. And these families have really intertwined the histories and the fates of the United States and Mexico for the past 150 years. So this is a long legacy. Now, one of my central arguments is that extended families, including women, children, and elderly, were regularly embarking on these cross-border journeys in the first decades of the 20th century, and they did so for family-centered reasons. Now, sometimes we don't think about this early part of the history, and mostly that has a lot to do with when the majority of migrations occurred. So we often think and look to the Bracero era in the 1940s as one of the driving factors for Mexican migrations. But we all know that with the establishment and growth of Mexican American communities, vibrant Mexican and American communities in the 20s and 30s, that certainly family migrations, women and children were migrating before that. And it's also important, again, to recognize that um, men also migrated in those early decades to join families, right? So it wasn't, again, just for labor. They sought to reunite with families and basically recreate families on the northern side of the border. Now, we know that male crossings in the early 20th centuries had become routine, especially from the northern Mexican states and the center-west states of Mexico, where the railroad connected Mexican population centers to sites across the border. But women embarked on courageous crossings, sometimes reuniting with family and sometimes on their own. It's worth noting that though in this talk I'll be tying female migrations to family migrations, women also came on their own to find work. Take, for example, the case of Micaela Carranza, who applied for a passport in 1920 with the specific intention of working in Exeter, a small agricultural town in the San Joaquin Valley of California. She'd been working in a cookie making factory in Guadalajara, Jalisco. She had good references from her employer, and she had a letter from her mother giving her permission to leave Mexico, showing government officials that she had family approval for her migrations. So in fact, by 1920, due in part to the linkages of the railroad, the demand for not just male, but family labor in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, and the massive displacement and expulsion caused by the Mexican Revolution, women and children had already crafted strategies to better ensure their entry into the United States. Now, before I go much further with this narrative, I want to point out a kind of periodization that really governs my work, but also to orient you as we talk about the female migrations that occur. So you could see there that one of the main periods that I like to emphasize is this family migration boom in the 1920s. And that's really significant to the history because it tells us that these communities, these binational communities and binational families were being created before the displacements of the Great Depression in the 1930s. And by looking at migration through this kind of female lens and this gendered lens, I actually see the Bracero era as a period in which both states were trying to reorder or reorganize migration away from a family migration that they knew was well underway, and that this was to drive really kind of the temporary migration and not the like long lasting residencies in the United States. And then I argue really that although the Bracero era, did reorder migrations and make them more male to a certain extent, family migration persisted. And families continued to try to cross, and again, took really creative ways to do so when, frankly, they weren't expected to cross the border. And so that's a little bit of the periodization that kind of gives an overview of the talk and also some of the work. Now, here's an image that I wanted to share. Again, I won't go too much into detail about the way in which the railroads contributed to that early 1890s migration, except to say that in the 1890s and early 1900s, the railroad had created these linkages, provided labor opportunities, and really just facilitated the migrations from the Center West states across the border into the United States. And we are starting to see already that not only male, but female labor is actually required and demanded in especially the US Southwest, which is being developed, into this kind of agricultural zone, and is basically creating a lot of this demand. But again, I'm going to be talking to you about the way in which labor and family is going to be constantly intertwined. Now, of course, one of the major factors that is going to drive migration is the Mexican Revolution. So here you actually see refugees crossing the border into the United States. And if you look closely there, you can see that there's a group of women mostly there that are leaving Mexico in order to escape some of the violence, and that there is going to be a kind of phase of family separations during the Mexican Revolution, and that's going to set up some of the migrations that we're going to see later on in the 1920s. We actually know, for example, also that there are sponsored migrations of women and of families throughout what was during basically the Mexican Revolution, but also what is the World War I period in the United States. And I show you this alien laborers identification card to illustrate the fact that not only do we see women who are crossing, but that they're being specifically sponsored and by American companies, in this case, the Arizona Cotton Growers Association. And you can look and find many of these. And so we know that women, along with their children, are being sponsored by mostly agricultural and mining outfits in the United States, which is again drawing this group of people across. And it's worth mentioning before I go further that women's migrations were certainly conditioned by gender, and their challenges to cross the border were conditioned by gendered expectations and gendered norms. Most often we kind of mention the likely to become a public charge restriction that is applied to the US, is applied to all borders in the United States, but is used in the US-Mexico border context in order to prohibit folks who are considered not likely to be able to, say, provide for themselves once they come to the United States, and that this exclusion is going to be targeting women for the most part, because again, there's an understanding that women are not heads of household, they're not able to potentially provide for themselves, and so women at the border are constantly going to be facing this obstacle, and they're going to have to prove that they have some sort of financial means, and usually that means that they have to prove that there is some male relative that can help support them. And so we see this is just an example of a board of special inquiry in 1919. Going to the next slide. Here we go. Is basically a transcript of an interrogation that is made to a widow, a woman, Maria Mendoza, who had been a widow for 2 years in 1919. And she was basically questioned as to her ability to provide for herself. That is the point of the the inquiry is to find out exactly how she plans to basically provide for herself and survive, knowing that she's a widow. And she's asked how she's been able to do it for the past 2 years. And she basically says that she was working in a kitchen, and that she is able to provide for herself and for her children. But that there are some relatives who might be able to help her out, especially an elder son. And so we could see even in the 1920s and leading up to the 1920s that women are going to have face more of a challenge in entering and crossing the border. So they're going to have to come up with some creative adaptations. Now, again, sometimes they're coming with their male family members, but sometimes they're going on their own, and they're having to prove essentially that they won't be taking any private or public charity. Now, by the 1920s, we see a large group of people and diverse identities migrating to Mexico, or migrating to the United States from Mexico. And this is just from a small sample size of passport applications that were made to the governor of Jalisco in 1920. And I encountered these passport applications and went through them really to kind of see who was trying to go to the United States and the reasons they were listing for wanting to go. And a surprising kind of revelation occurred when I found that there were at least 64 to 65% of people that mentioned that they were going specifically for family reasons. Now, sometimes they mentioned labor also, but they were men, they were women, and they were often mentioning wanting to reunite with family, wanting to visit family, wanting to take care of perhaps sick family members. But that is a large percentage of those passports who are looking to do to basically cross and go into the United States for family purposes. And I just to show you, there are folks that are saying that they would like to work and they would like to embark on commercial activities. Maybe they're businessmen. Again, we're thinking about all different classes here that are trying to migrate to the United States. But that's an overwhelming majority of folks who are mentioning something about family as they travel. So again, this is all to suggest that by 1920, family migration is important and central, not just labor migration. Now, these are a couple pictures of a family that had basically repeatedly tried to migrate to the United States. And in a very typical fashion, we do see chain migration where the father and this family and the eldest brother attempted to migrate first over to the United States, and these family members would follow. I know at least that the first time the husband of the woman pictured here and her eldest son had attempted to cross, they were unable to. They didn't have a specific place that they were able to identify that they wanted to go to the United States. And so they learned through a series of applications and a series of attempts to cross the border how to better make it across. And then we see that the family here in these passport applications are going to join them, and they are actually going to be successful in migrating to the United States. I want to bring up this story also just to kind of give you an understanding of some of the challenges, again, that women face. Now, the woman on the past slide was able to migrate, and she was basically given a passport and seen as being part of a family unit. And in that case, that helped her. But we do know that single women, again, had difficulty, not only because they might not be able to prove that they could provide for themselves, but there's a rich literature that goes over the fact that single women, into the 1920s were still suspected potentially of immoral actions and immoral intentions. And that was something that plagued single women trying to go to the United States. And this is actually a memo that was sent to U.S. immigration authorities. And it's worth noting that it was sent to immigration authorities in El Paso, Eagle Pass, and Laredo from the U.S. consul. So that is a number of authorities that were alerted to this potential, to this woman who was potentially trying to cross. Now, the description that was given in this memo is very interesting. We see that it warned officials to be on the lookout for a woman who was alleged to be a person of a very nervous temperament and a notorious woman of ill repute. The US consul had basically warned that 26-year-old Francisca Alicia Gonzalez would be attempting to enter the United States with the intention of going to Detroit, Michigan, and actually has a specific address there. And that the cause for the warning was to alert immigration officials that she would be ineligible for admission to the United States. She was described to have an alias her alias was Aurora Garcia. And the following description stated that she was 5 feet 5 inches, approximately 150 pounds, dark brown hair, dark brown eyes, and a tendency to bite her fingernails to the quick. Very specific instructions to look out for this potentially dangerous woman who was crossing. Basically, a person had gone out of their way to report her to the US consul and promised that she was known to health authorities in Guadalajara, and that they would secure certificates issued by the health authorities against this woman and give it to the consul. Now, this is a picture here of Francisca Alicia Gonzalez. So a picture was attached to the warning as well. Now, was Francisca Alicia Gonzalez indeed a woman with a nervous temperament and a woman of ill repute? Was it her nervous temperament that would cause her to be denied entry into the United States, or her ill repute? And what does all of that mean? Again, the term of ill repute is a common idiom for prostitution in that time, and would have signaled to immigration authorities that she should be excluded from the United States for moral turpitude. Again, a woman of kind of depraved in her sexuality, and ultimately suggesting that she was a woman beyond control. So I would actually love to tell you how this story ends, but so often, as it is for us researchers that kind of pour over these boxes of files, that this remains a fragment of a story. As much as I've searched, I don't know what becomes of Francisca slash Aurora. What I can tell you is that in my mission to learn more about women crossing the border during this period, her case stands out. And it stands out not so much because there was a memo to warn officials about her entering the country. There were plenty of memos that were sent about the suspicious behavior of men, but it just shows that there was a certain kind of control applied to women, and single women in particular, who were crossing. Now, again, we don't know whether Alicia was in fact a prostitute. No certificates were sent along to confirm this possibility. We don't know if maybe she was a madam. Was the informant a scorned lover or a concerned citizen? Perhaps Alicia was just a woman who acted different and nervous, maybe unhinged or affected by some other form of trauma or control. We don't actually know if she maybe could be a shrewd businesswoman. Maybe she was a moral threat. What we do know is that she was single. She was 26 years old, and she ventured out from Guadalajara, Mexico, and she attempted or wanted to get all the way to Detroit, Michigan. Did she make it to her final destination? I will still look to find out, but I will just also offer this map to kind of show the distance of these migrations. Okay, so this is a big undertaking in the 1920s for a young single Mexican woman who was trying to cross the border. And again, that is a great distance there to get up to Detroit. Now, many women did successfully enter the United States. Again, they were often part of extended families, and they became vital to the agricultural production in places throughout the Southwest, but also in the Midwest. And so, for example, here we have basically a pamphlet for sugar beet workers. And you can see that there are young boys on the left and women on the right. And the whole point of this section was to encourage women in how to better can fruit and vegetables and provide for their families. And so we know that, again, agricultural outfits are recruiting often women and children as part of these families to come and do labor in anything from cotton, wheat, sugar beets, anything from truck crops, apricots, peas, citrus, especially in Southern California. And so we see that women are being included in this. And essentially, they're actually an invitation to stay over for longer periods of time to sustain the winter in particular, so that agricultural employers don't lose some of their workforce. Women and children at this point in time are actually seen as domesticating kind of factors for male migrants who might otherwise want to move on to another job or another work site, particularly if they weren't being treated well. The idea here is that if families had come with them, it would stabilize the workforce. So they become a huge part of the Mexican migration stream in the 1920s. Now, by paying attention specifically to the women who crossed, we also get a sense for the families they created, and in particular, the children that they might have had. And based on a number of basically train manifests that I was able to find, and I was able to find those, they were train manifests of the Great Depression. I was able to find many different families that listed the different birth dates and birthplaces of their children. And so here I just want to show you that we have, this is a fairly typical example of a binational family that's being created in the 1920s. And it's being created in the 1920s because of circular migration. Okay, so if you can follow with me the arrows here, you'll see that by looking at the entire family and their birthplaces, we know, for example, that the father and mother were both born in Guanajuato. That's that kind of star looking, the red looking star down in the center of Mexico. But that if you follow the red arrow, you will see that the first child was born in Denver, Colorado. At least suggesting that the mother had gone to Denver, Colorado at some point and given birth to her first child in 1919. Then we see, if we follow the second line there in the purple arrow, that they would have returned to Benjamín, Guanajuato to have their second child. And then again, this might have just been the mother. We see that at some point in time, they moved back up to the United States to Santa Rita, New Mexico, to have the third child, and that is the blue arrow there. And then if you follow that pink arrow, you see that the fourth child was born in Simons, California at the end of the 1920s. Now, there we kind of understand broadly that there's circular migration occurring during this time. We know that women are perhaps moving one way, but we can really tell by looking at the birth records here and the birth dates that women are going back and forth and creating families in many different locations, going back and forth across an international border, but also traversing several states. And so this is the kind of work that basically shows us the dynamism of the migrations, but also what the communities will look like in the United States that are composed of these binational families with both Mexican and US citizens. Now, this dynamism is going to continue in the 1920s. There is going to be a continued demand for, again, laborers, but also aside from that, whether there is a demand in particular for laborers, folks are wanting to reunite with families, women continue crossing, and this is going to be that big family boom until, of course, the Great Depression. Now, this is the part in the story where we also see that, according to other scholars, we know that we lost basically a generation of Mexican American children going back to Mexico, not necessarily growing up in the United States, perhaps returning in their teens. But when we see the repatriations, that's when we have a better understanding of how many women and children had crossed in the first place. Because by most estimates, we know that at least 25 to 50% of repatriates were women and children. The train manifests that I've been able to look at in all of the sample sizes suggest that out of the 100% of a sample size, 25% are children and 25% are women. So you have half of the groups returning are women and children, and most of those children were born in the United States. Here's an image of that list. different types of list with different information. You can see a family kind of showcased there if you were to read all the way through. Now, I know that's a lot of text, but really briefly, you basically see the parents that are there, and then the children ages 9, 5, 7, 2, and 3. And again, you're able to see their birthplaces. So you're able to see that their parents are born in Mexico, firstborn also in Mexico, and then the other children are born in Fresno and then Holtville, California. So again, this is another example. And these families would have been repatriated. Many of them are repatriated together, but again, composed of different citizenship status. Now, this creates separated families. This creates repatriated US born children. And this is actually one of the things, this is one of the sections of the book that is often intriguing, because we see that we have a whole generation of US born Mexican children who would return to Mexico that are trying to get back to what they consider their country. This is one of my favorites. This kind of stands out to me, and I often like to incorporate it into the presentations because we see the first line, "Dear Uncle Sam or President." Now, this is a young woman, Nicha Rodriguez, who was writing from Nochitlan, Zacatecas in 1936, and writes this letter to President Roosevelt, and asks for help to return to the United States. She basically, in the tradition of many folks that are writing to President Roosevelt, but then also many folks are also writing to President Lázaro Cárdenas during this period. And so this is part of a broader tradition of writing to the president. But she writes to the president, describing her situation, describing her family, and stating that, again, there were 7 children born in the state of Iowa. Again, we don't think of Iowa as a place for Mexican immigrants in the early part of the 20th century. But when looking at family, we're able to see beyond, again, some of the more traditional labor sites. And we know, in fact, that families spread out across the United States. She goes on to describe the situation, stating that they were able to come with the help of the American consul there. It's just part of the repatriation campaign there, and that the Mexican consul was also supposed to help in that effort, but we're not able to, and that her father had to sell the car that they had, and they basically are stuck and suffer from hunger and education. So this is evidence of not only these families that are going back and forth, but that have this is where the biculturalism comes into play, because they're identifying with their US roots, but they are clearly living in Mexico. And this is, again, trying to trace out all of these many, many stories that we broadly have an understanding of the numbers, but we don't actually know what their stories, in fact, look like. Now, while this is happening, we know, for example, that there are still families that are able to make their lives just, without being repatriated. And so Mexican American communities are still existing. We just don't see as many migrations going to the United States. And often this era of time is reported as migration net zero, but I would encourage, especially all the students here, not to pay attention to the numbers sometimes, because net zero represents, it does not tell us how many crossings there were. Okay, and so we need to understand that maybe they equaled or they canceled each other out, but there is still a lot of movement across the US-Mexico border during this time. Let's see. Now, the 1930s era is basically buttressed here in the 1940s and in 1942 with the creation of what I call the New Gendered Order, or the Bracero program. Now, this is the point in time where usually we start our modern histories of Mexican immigration. And so what I wanted to offer you today was to think about the many migrations that occurred before, the fact that binational families were created before, that women had crossed, that they'd given birth in both places and were are central to building up community before we had this kind of major bi-national or basically by both governments, this effort to reorder migrations. Now, the Bracero program is certainly going to kick off a number of migrations, and it's going to basically facilitate even more family migrations. And I know that we're going to have a couple of speakers who will speak specifically to that. So I won't go into that in too much detail, but it's worth noting that, for example, let's see, I'll go back here, that this was a point in time where rather than family migrations, it was well known that there was an opportunity, but it was going to be only for male laborers. So any migrations that had existed before, any kind of family migrations that were facilitated by family members, including women that were central to facilitating the migrations for other brothers or uncles or sisters or aunts, that they were essentially cut out of this equation because there was such an emphasis on making sure that the braceros, the temporary male laborers, were going to be coming into the United States. So what we see here is another kind of moment in which families are separated. And one of the things that I really want to point out is that we often think about the men that go. A lot of reports suggest that they were solo laborers, that they were not married. However, again, when looking for the women, we find that in fact, many of them were married. And if they were not married, it still does not mean that they were not part of broader families. So many of these men were going in order to provide for their families or help out their families in some kind of way. And there were actual applications or letters written to the president of Mexico by women who were asking to be a part of this program. They wanted to go too. They wanted either to accompany family relatives, or they wanted to go and work. And so this became something that was only male, and it cut out a lot of kind of the family connections in that sense. But by the late 1940s and 1950s, we see that that women are going to persist in their migrations. So, for example, in the book, I mentioned a group of braceros who go and are hired in Texas, and they have been reported as sneaking their family across the border to be with them, and are told that they are unable to keep their bracero contracts because of this situation. In the end, the braceros themselves are able to kind of fight back. They're able to get the employer blacklisted, and are able to kind of wage a counteroffensive, and actually decide to stay with their families, but get out of the bracero program. So there are a lot of stories here that we still have to uncover. I think what I'll do now is, just because I want to leave a lot of time for question and answers and talk more a little bit about methods. I will just kind of say that, again, what we start to think of as mostly male migrations, we're always going to have to ask ourselves, first of all, are these men, if we do look at just men, if they are part of larger family migrations. And then we have to be able to understand that they are not, even if they come alone, depending on when you catch them at a certain point in time, that they are documented, again, probably in the bracero records, that we know very little about the other migrations and family migrations that are potentially happening around them. Now, this happens to a certain degree, I would argue, because we aren't looking for it. We've been told so much that mostly men are coming that often we forget to look for women. But another big feature is that the deportation processes and detainment processes are also very gendered. So we know, for example, in the 1960s, in the 1950s and 60s, that when women and children are entering, or perhaps they've entered without documentation, that they are often taken to the border and basically participate in something called voluntary return, and they're never documented. So women are not documented, sometimes coming in and sometimes going out, and thus are undocumented twice over. We also know, just from methods of of trying to find these histories, that the folks, ethnographers, interviewers who go out and try to find these histories are not often able to access women, right? So if they go to sites where there are deportation raids have been conducted, those are mostly male labor sites. And so we don't in fact know what families look like and which families are perhaps going back to Mexico under the radar. So there are a lot of different things to kind of consider, but I want to just put all of that out there for the Q&A section, and we can go into any of these periods. And I suspect that John has a couple different questions he wants to ask, and I would be happy also to elaborate a little bit more on some of the personal connections to the work now that I've set up kind of the overview of the first half of the 20th century, hopefully, so that we have something to orient ourselves for the next 7 talks of this really exciting series.
Thank you, Larissa. I do have a couple of questions, things I would open. And I guess the first is a theme that, yeah, specialists in migration know this, but a lot of the folks learning today, the turnaround from basically enticing migrants in, male and female, in the 20s, and you made that point, to sending them home. In the early 30s, very late 20s, early 30s is when most of it happens. And you broadly laid out that to some degree, not universally, but men are being drawn to labor. Women are actually being drawn to both labor and to sustain families. In a sense, they've got that dual role, the double work burden, if you will. And that links, we know, you know, but I'm not sure our audience does. How was it that local authorities, shall we say, engineered the departure? Because it wasn't a national policy. I'd love to hear you share with this group how local authorities across the Southwest use, shall we say, the challenges of sustenance to encourage Mexican families, including their US-born children, US citizens.
Right. Yeah, and that's thank you for asking that question, because I know that this comes up in a lot of the kind of papers, questions in the coursework that I teach on Mexican migration. And there's this notion that there was an organized national campaign to do this. And really what we know is it depended on very local circumstances. Probably Abraham Hoffman's work on Los Angeles stands out the most in depicting how the Placita raids, very specific raids in Los Angeles, were carried out in order to basically take Mexicans across the border very coercively, I'll say. There's these stories of folks that were unable to actually settle their business in the United States. There were homeowners, there were Mexican and Mexican-American homeowners, people that were completely integrated into the community that were basically swept up in some of these raids. And so these efforts were really local. We know that we see a kind of push. It's not in the same way in El Paso, for example. El Paso also was very dependent on domestic labor during that time. So it's going to look different in every place. We know that there were, for example, mob violence in Detroit targeting Mexican and Mexican Americans. So this is going to look very different in all places. And of course, it's going to emerge because of the Great Depression and this idea that American work should be reserved for, quote, Americans. Now, there's a lot of questions as to why Mexicans in particular, as opposed to other immigrant groups, are targeted. And I think the consensus really basically shows that it's kind of the easiest. It's a contiguous nation that to take them across to the border, to deposit them. And then also that there will be kind of this hysteria that's drummed up even if you do this in a couple locations, there is this kind of understanding that amongst the Mexican and Mexican American community, that they might not be as safe, that their jobs might not be safe, and they might not be safe if they stayed. So there is kind of this movement to just cause enough fear for people to go back, even though they had been establishing lives in the United States. And I have a personal story I'll mention really quickly. It's the famous personal story that I'll bring in, and somewhere and someday I'll write about it. But for example, I never knew that my grandfather was in fact born in the United States. And actually my grandmother hadn't known that for the first part of their married life together. Found out that he was in fact born in El Paso, but we all always thought he'd grown up in Zacatecas. And basically, he was one of those children who was born in the United States and left in the 1930s. And I recall asking my grandmother in an oral history that I did with her, and I said, "Well, why did he leave?" And she said, "Well, that's just the time period that the Mexicans had to leave." And so there was also this kind of psychological, I guess you can almost say, terror that was waged on some of the Mexican American communities that very suddenly shifted what was again an increased demand for family labor in the 1920s. And then that economic contraction happens, and then there's this really targeted effort to basically have Mexicans return back to Mexico. And there's a range of really kind of cruel methods to do this. And then there were also some folks, some welfare officials that really were hoping that perhaps there were Mexican family members that had a little bit more means that might be able to take care of them. And so you see just, hundreds of thousands of repatriates boarding trains back to Mexico during this period.
And I guess I'm recalling that there were stories that I think in LA and elsewhere that local relief boards, if putting out, meals for the destitute. When Mexicans showed up, no questions asked about citizenship status, mom, dad, kids. If you were Mexican, you didn't get the meal, you got a ticket to the border.
Right. Yeah.
In a sense, they deny sustenance.
Yes. Yeah.
Is that all up another part of this equation? Am I remembering correctly?
Yeah, I think that's the thing. I think it's going to depend again locally, but I guess you could say a version of that. Again, I'll use El Paso as the reference, is the idea there that in particular those folks who were commuters, you would close off the bridge during certain times so that they could not make any money and provide for themselves. So yeah, basically elimination of services.
Yeah.
And elimination of services, elimination of sustenance was one way to kind of drive this return migration.
Okay, so I now want to take you further into the talk. I want to sort of get that turnaround a little more into the conversation. You mentioned toward the end the dual undocumentation. That yes, at a time when, right, in the era of bracero recruitment, men often came documented. The women who came with them often did not. The US deported without documenting undocumented women's deportation. Can you say a little bit more about how that sort of has a foundational role in the origins of, shall we say, the larger communities of undocumentation? Because that, of course, really became a conversation more recently.
Yeah, definitely. So, and this is something I came to a little bit later in my research. I was really just trying to find traces of women who were going to the United States. And then realizing, especially after the Great Depression, where we have some evidence, we see trains, for example, where we see people leaving, that there isn't as much about women being deported throughout the first entire part of the 20th century. And then I was able to find fragments here and there. For example, I found an example or incident in 1929. So this is before the Great Depression, where immigration officials are trying to figure out where to hold 5 women immigrants who are to be deported, but they don't actually have the infrastructure to detain them. So even that, there was not infrastructure to detain them. We know that male migrants were held sometimes in prison, federal prison, and sometimes in local jails, but there wasn't that place for women to be held. So we actually see that because there isn't these kind of essentially holding places, that they would be often just taken over to the border and not documented in the process. Now, voluntary departures are documented at certain points in time, but there are countless times where the Border Patrol essentially is completely understaffed. And there is a directive to them that there isn't enough staff. There aren't enough judges to actually even go through deportation hearings, especially in the 50s and 60s. And so that we know that in that case, especially women and children, there isn't this idea to document them, to even necessarily be punitive with them. And that's probably the basis that, a gender kind of assumption is that they won't try to return. And that's when we know that, especially with repeat, I guess you could say, folks who try to repeatedly enter and without being documented, those were the ones that were often put into prisons and detained. And there was an assumption that women and children would not try again, although I'm pretty certain, although again, it's hard to document that women and children were going to make that trip to try and reunite with other family members or make a living for themselves. So this definitely is something that needs to be explored more for the first part of the 20th century, but it really sets up our understanding of the idea. When we tend to talk about modern migration history, we include women in the numbers in like the 70s and 80s. All of a sudden, it seems that if you look at numbers in the 70s and 80s, and especially even with undocumented migrants, all of a sudden women make up, 47% of the migration flow. And so again, there's a little bit of a disjuncture there. And so we need to be able to highlight that this has been happening over time and that this documentation is lacking going into the country, but also back out of the country.
We got a few questions, and I'm going to start. First one came from one of so Ruben Hernandez Leon, the sociologist and head of Latin American Center at UCLA these days, opened with, and it's nice to have conversations among our presenters. He will be our presenter at the end of February. Thanks for the fascinating talk, he writes, and then asks, can you tell us more about your methods? How did you go about tracking and following the experiences of women?
Well, thank you for the question. And I have to say, Ruben, I don't know if you remember, but you took, I was part of a trip that you took UCLA students to in 2006 to Guanajuato. And I was actually snuck in as a grad student while I was at the University of California at Santa Barbara. And so a lot of my questions were developed during those 5 wonderful weeks in Guanajuato, where I learned a lot about this kind of transnational migration. So thank you for the question. And yeah, so this is one of the more exciting parts of my work is the methods and how to trace it. It is difficult, again, with migration in general, but with women in particular, especially if we're not seeing any of these documentations, or if they're not generally represented in these kind of aggregate numbers. And so initially I just started looking kind of at consular correspondence. So consuls in Mexico, US consuls in Mexico, corresponding with folks who were trying to go to the United States. And so you actually are able to see letters, questions about the process, about the fees, about how to make sure that these women could actually be successful in their entry. And so there's not a lot. I basically, wherever I can find them, I start to try to tease out the story, but that's one of the ways that I first started. And in terms of, the repatriation era, I think that was probably, that's just a serendipitous find when I was able to find 500 repatriates that were on these train manifests, and they actually had names, and you were able to tell gender and able to construct these families. And so they are in the archives. They're just in places that we don't traditionally think to look. And so that's one of the ways that I started to do that. And then kind of considering this idea that women aren't documented on their way out, you have to pretty much just think about where you would find women, right? So that might be looking at welfare records. That might be looking at places where you're going to see not just such an extreme focus on kind of the male laborers. And it's really just parsing all of that out, trying to be attentive to the fact also that we're not just thinking about women as like just the wives of male laborers, right? We're thinking about children, we're thinking about daughters, we're thinking about mothers. Many male migrants who come in the 1920s are coming with their mothers. And this again is something that we don't often see or hear, but if you just, even just paying attention to the stories of men crossing, you can find the bigger kind of family units and family dynamics. And that's something that I followed those threads wherever I could find them. And I'm very thankful to all the archivists who showed me anything that could be of use, like the passport applications.
All right, thanks. I'm going to move to Ashley Garcia, who says, hello, Larissa. Thank you so much for sharing your contribution. Very interesting. My work, her work, concentrates on North Mexican women's migration in the 1980s. However, I'm wondering if in your work, you have any leads insight on how multiple displacements from Mex and US affected migrants' physical and mental health, especially women.
That's a great question, Ashley. And I will say that I wish I knew more. The documents that I do find don't reveal a lot about the kind of intimate worlds or the mental health status. But I will say that there are quite a few examples from the consular correspondence where you could tease out a little bit more about how these displacements are impacting women. So for example, and again, there's no infrastructure to deal, there's not really good infrastructure to deal with binational families, to deal with kind of the hardships of living across the border, to deal with these displacements. So these US consular officials become these kind of de facto almost welfare workers, and in some ways these counselors to women who, for example, are living in Mexico but are trying to get to the United States. Sometimes I have evidence of women that are trying to escape abusive husbands. That's a hard story to tell, but that's a story that's there, and you can find some of that in the correspondence. But I think that's done much better for the 70s and 80s. And the way to get to that is through oral histories. And so my second project, for example, is going to be based on oral histories of women who migrated between 1950 and 1986. And so that there, when you talk to women and you're able to get those oral histories, you're able to kind of delve a little bit more into what that displacement looked like, what it felt like, how they were able to sustain all of these multiple kind of basically absorb the burden of having to move families across borders. So it's a great question. I think there's a lot to be done on that. Unfortunately, I think there's another avenue to it, but you have to really be able to analyze the text very carefully. And that is there's a series of cases that might be brought up to immigration officials about women very similar to the one that I pointed out that seem to be acting different or unhinged. And I often ask myself whether it's just because they aren't expressing normative behavior for that time period, and if that's because they've been displaced multiple times. And so you kind of have to read between the lines a little bit for that earlier period, but oral histories is the way to get at some of that for the second part of the 20th century.
Again, thanks. A quick entry. Ruben Hernandez Leon came back in and said, of course I remember. Yeah. And I wanted to make sure that got shared. Next question from Santiago Bestillero, one of your successors as a doctoral student here at Georgetown. Hi, Larissa. Thank you for your presentation. My question is, how did the internal dynamics of these families change? Did migration alter the respective roles of wives and husbands, or the relationships between parents and children, for example, in any particular way?
Yeah, well, so what I'll say for, again, my time period and the families that I look at is the most obvious change is that women become laborers and basically co-household providers in the United States, especially if male laborers at the time where they're expected to be breadwinners are suffering from kind of downward social mobility. So that definitely is going to alter the dynamics of families. Again, in order to get to that, I would love to rely more on the testimonies from migrants themselves, and we just didn't have enough ethnographies done and interviews done for people at the time in the 30s and the 40s to kind of give us that picture. When that actually became much more integrated into interviews, into anthropology, it was especially taken up by Mexican scholars who were looking at the changing family dynamics, and that those were resulting from the increase of migrations in the 1970s. So there's actually a lot of scholarship, again, mostly Mexican female anthropologists that highlight that and are asking the questions about how it actually changes the dynamics. Does it change like the patriarchal construction of the families? In which way are the children actually listening to their fathers or deferring to their mothers? The way in which household duties are kind of redistributed. So again, I would point you in the direction of some of the Mexican female anthropologists who were doing work in the 1970s and 80s for that.
And again, thanks. Next question from Diana Lopez. Dr. Berlos, thank you for a great presentation. Can you share with us how you developed an interest in this topic? And again, thank you.
Well, and most people who know me and who I've talked to, and John mentioned it at the outset, is that there's a very personal family connection to the story.
So
and then
share it.
well, and so there's oftentimes I've come to start to describe myself as a third generation migrant or binational migrant, in the sense that there is a long history of binational migration on both sides of the family for me. And really the way that I started to think about these were questions and to think about this topic was when I would sit around and listen to my grandmothers in particular talk to me about their stories, about how they grew up, about their migrations. And then I decided that I was going to turn that into an MA thesis and ask a couple of their friends about their stories as well, to understand what I saw was an absence of women's stories in the historiography. So I initially wanted to start out writing what I called the anti-bracero history, because I was like, of course we know that there was this, dual government kind of sponsored program that had men come. And we know that that many families basically started their migrations during that time period in the 1940s. But I had proof that women were migrating in the 40s and that they were migrating in the 50s and even before that. And so I wanted to know a little bit more about that. And I was struck by the way in which the stories of my grandmothers in particular, what they had to do to navigate a binational, migration for their many children, essentially, they're crossing with many children, and what they had to do, how they had to adjust once they got to the United States, but also what their life looked like in Mexico, what drove them and how they did it. The process was super interesting to me. How do you move a family across a border? How do you sell off your furniture to do it? Do you have contacts on the other side? Do you take the train? Do you walk? Do you take the bus? That process was fascinating to me because I think uncovering that process really shows us much more about what migrations look like and the small decisions that people made along the way, as opposed to just kind of an overall notion that that men had the idea to migrate and women and family just followed. So that's what kicked off the history for me.
And our next question is almost the perfect follow-up from Freddie Cabral. Again, great presentation. As a student, he asks, can you tell us more about the process of doing research in Mexico? At least one big example or challenge, we would face if we go to do similar research in Mexico.
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. And yeah, first I will say to anybody who can get to who can go. My research time in Mexico was one of the best years of my life. It was amazing to be in the archives there. It is challenging. You have to figure out archives. First of all, for those students, you have to figure out how, how to navigate archives in the United States in your own language, potentially. And then you have to kind of translate some of that knowledge across the border, make connections with archivists there, run into different ways of cataloging and organizing the information and making sure that you have access to what you want, and then be able to communicate what it is you're studying to archivists down there. I'll say that one of my major challenges had to do with access. The Immigration Archive is kind of notoriously difficult to get into, and so it's going to take some persistence, that's for sure. And the physical kind of archives and warehouse usually isn't open to very many folks, and so I had to do a lot of my work based off of what was digitized. And I could only access it in the computers in the Immigration Institute there, and I had to kind of search that way. And so there's a lot more records out there. You just have to figure out how to navigate that, and really making sure to be clear about what it is you're looking for in studying to the archivist. And again, I actually just did a whole graduate class yesterday on this, about making friends with the archivist and telling them about what you're interested in, so that they can help you out along the way. And if they find anything, that's they can point you in that direction. But really just persistence. You'll face a couple of different obstacles perhaps, but it's so worth it to try, because that's where you find an abundance of material, and that's really the only way to do better borderlands histories also, is to make sure that we're doing the work in Mexico.
I'm going to play two sides against the middle as a follow-up there, which is, and how about your successes finding letters to presidents in the US? People don't often think about going to the US presidential archives to do migration history or women in migration history. Share how that happened.
Yeah, well, that's what, and I will say, for anybody who's still trying to figure out what it is they're working on, there are more presidential archives to mine and to go and to look for this. I focused on the Roosevelt era, and so I made a trip out to Roosevelt's library to look for things. I was able to find a couple things there, but consular reports, again, is actually where I found the letters that were to the president, because what would happen is that, somebody would write a letter to President Roosevelt. They would look and see where it was addressed to. They'd send it over to that consul, that US consul in Mexico, and it would become part of their files. And so that was just something that, the fact that I was able to find, and that's not including letters that were written by men, right? Or young men, or to President Roosevelt, but even having, 5 to 10 letters that you can really dive into that were addressed specifically to President Roosevelt, it gives us a whole kind of understanding of the way that people kind of understand their own citizenship, the way that they communicate with the state. And so migrants are, again, they're binational, so we can look in the archives of two places. So stay kind of creative, think about presidential papers on both sides. For Mexico, I was really lucky that the presidential archives are one of the series of archives that are organized the best, and indexed, right, and cataloged. So
and to sort of make sometimes not so good diplomatic relations help the researcher. So the letters to the president often never got to the president, but that meant they were sitting in the consular archives that got to the accessible US archives, and you could get them there. It didn't change what the woman who wrote it was saying, only required recognizing that FDR didn't read it. Whereas one suspects, I don't know if you want to comment on this, that perhaps Cárdenas read a few more himself in Mexico. It was sort of his being, but
yeah, I would say so. I would say definitely. I think that was something that, he kind of in his way made a commitment as being one of the people's, the people's president, to do so. And again, yeah, they don't often land with the president. It does matter if you know somebody, though. If you know the personal secretary of the president, for example, that letter might get through, and you see that happening. So I'm occasionally able to find the entire story, but a lot of this is based on fragments. And again, it's just, kind of like you have to have persistence to be able to then piece that together, take the information from kind of a fragment and then follow that through, try to find these folks and try to locate them in there, and know that that's just like a slice of their migration history.
Yeah.
Right? Most of these histories are much more complicated, are involve many more migrations. We just get literally a snapshot, and as historians, it's our job to try to build out from that.
Great, thanks. And so the next question really shows that this conversation about Mexico and women and challenges has its resonances out. So it is from Marisa Macias, and she says, I worked with a Salvadoran family, mother who had her children brought to the US some years later. She worked with the family in 1984 while she was a freshman and sophomore in SFS. So she was at Georgetown before either you or I. 10 years later, she ran into one of them at a restaurant in DC. They were doing great. Her concern is about policy that has not been implemented in 30 years, where non-Mexican migrants are being returned to Mexican territory, not their home countries. The situation in border cities in Mexico is terrible, especially as they're preyed upon by cartels. Mexican army is deployed on the southern border to prevent these. The Mexican president, for decades, as a candidate, condemned US immigration policy. Now he's doing much the same. An important statement that policies evolve and change. I'll let you comment as you wish, or just say, yeah, worth sharing.
Yeah, well, and I think, this is something that, so we definitely see a change in the 80s, in the 70s and 80s, when Central American immigration becomes really kind of, it almost takes precedence, or it takes the center story, even over Mexican migration during that period. And I mean, the best way to state it is, I think it's really an issue of both countries, the United States and Mexico, essentially are trying to pass the buck back and forth about who is supposed to care for or take responsibility for this kind of immigration, and then also provide a kind of, whether anybody's supposed to provide some kind of sanctuary. And so I think that it's just a matter of passing the responsibility back and forth until, we know that kind of the UN got more involved in the 1980s with refugee policy, with determining that. And so I think it's difficult. I think the United States probably, I mean, they do have an influence in the way that Mexico is going to conduct their policies. We know that the Mexican immigration system and Mexican immigration officials basically have been discovered to have these, very kind of, sometimes corrupt practices. And so we basically, or what we're seeing is this kind of capitalism, this kind of, the way in which the markets are changing, and labor is basically confined, to certain places, and this grab, this attempt to get to the United States, and it's going to, I think, keep happening. And it happens all over the globe, really. And when you basically, I guess you could say the global South, but there's different places where we see this happening. So this is not just a problem within the United States or within Mexico, but there is this ability, or I mean, it's partially, I don't think, we as a greater population are always understanding of these diplomatic relationships, but they just pass the buck back and forth.
Yeah. I'm going to leap in a little bit and maybe preview a little bit of what I'm going to talk about in 2 or so weeks, which is in the big picture, in the background, I'm going to say, for the long haul, up into the 70s, there was a never policy stated, but there was a real demand for Mexicans to come and work in the United States, set the Depression aside, right? So whatever tensions and difficulties employers were waiting, there was a certain welcoming, and a lot of the border restrictions, I'll cynically say, were there to make sure those who came were limited, controlled, and not, right, easily in defense of their own rights. Subsequently, for a variety of reasons, shall we say, the shift has not been that there's less a need in Central America or Mexico, and it comes and goes in waves, but not a less of a need for ways of sustenance for families, etc. But there is less of an acceptance of a need in the US. So the turn to constraint has, I think, become much more serious. And I will simply politely say, as we mentioned earlier, I mean, the extreme example, the Lázaro Cárdenas your woman wrote to was a very different leader from anybody we've seen for a while. And what's often not forgotten is that he carried on as a towering figure in the regime, in the country, in the background of real influence deep into the 60s. And so there's a certain kind of possibility of at least negotiation. I don't want to make things too ideal in appearance. And boy, have things crunched down. But then really what I'm going to say as we get to the end of time, our last question has really opened up. We need to keep looking into the long term, into other aspects and into other things. And I do not see an additional question on my Q and A. And as I do not, if nobody is about to leap in, then what I do want to do is first thank Larissa for an engaging presentation and engaging so many diverse questions, and thank all of the participants and audience who have come, engaged, listened, asked questions, and encourage you to come back a week for today, in which my Georgetown colleague, History American Studies, Mireya Losa, will focus on the long-term evolution of circular labor, of the recruitment and return of mostly men, but not always men, in agricultural work. So we're going to keep looking at other aspects of this. After that, I'm going to take on some of what I will call the macro structural gains and challenges. And Ruben Hernandez Leon, who we have heard from a bit today, will at the end of the month look at, because by the late 20th century, Mexico was far more urban than rural, and it started to be urban people who come from urban regions to the US, to a whole new side of migration at that point. So again, I'm going to thank you all very much and say we look forward to seeing you next week.